the remote mountain town of Braxton Hollow, a haunted Army veteran and K-9 handler was about to confront something no war could prepare him for. A simple missing persons case turned deadly when a government-buried experiment began warping the forest and mines with impossible precision. Sergeant Nate Halvorsen wasn't your typical small-town deputy. For 10 years, he was Special Operations K-9, deployed in Afghanistan, credited with saving over a dozen lives during classified operations in hostile territory. When a federal task force sent him into the woods with his loyal dog Echo, they had no idea they were sending a war-hardened tracker into a living nightmare. Nate followed Echo's alert into the mist, unaware it would trigger a descent into shifting time, fractured identity, and echoes that weren't truly his. What began as a routine search for a missing teenager would become a confrontation with reality itself. The forest surrounding Braxton Hollow would never be the same after Sergeant Halvorsen discovered what watches from the other side of perception. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain fell in sheets, turning the gravel lot of the Braxton Hollow Sheriff's Department into a muddy delta. Sergeant Nate Halvorsen killed the engine of his weathered Ford Ranger and rested his forehead against the steering wheel for one last moment of solitude. Not exactly the quiet assignment we were promised, is it, girl? In the custom kennel behind his seat, Echo's ears perked forward. The German Shepherd's amber eyes tracked his movements with the unwavering focus that had saved his life twice overseas. Nate reached back to scratch between her ears, finding comfort in the simple ritual. Let's get this over with. Braxton Hollow sat like a splinter at the edge of one of the last true wilderness areas in the continental United States. Population 846, according to the rain-faded welcome sign. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where outsiders were tolerated but never truly welcomed. Perfect for a man trying to outrun his memories. Chief Walter Boone didn't rise when Nate entered, just gestured to a metal chair across from his cluttered desk. The older man's face was weathered like old leather, deep lines framing pale blue eyes that held Nate in a calculating stare. Army? Boone asked, eyeing Nate's posture. 10 years K-9 handler, Special Operations. Afghanistan? Nate nodded once, the familiar ache blooming behind his sternum. Echo pressed against his leg, a warm anchor to the present. 5 people gone in 8 weeks, Boone said, sliding a folder across the desk. Last one was my grandson, Lucas, 17. Nate flipped through the missing persons reports, noting the similarities. All had disappeared along the eastern ridge. All were last seen entering the forest. No bodies recovered. Any pattern to the disappearances? Time of day? Weather conditions? Nothing concrete. A new voice, crisp and clinical. The woman standing in the doorway wore a bureau windbreaker and held a stainless steel travel mug. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, revealing sharp features and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Agent Talia Rowe, she said, extending her hand. Behavioral analysis. Nate shook it, noting her firm grip. Sergeant Nate Halvorsen, this is Echo. Talia crouched, offering her hand palm up to Echo, who sniffed it cautiously before allowing a quick pat. Beautiful dog. Belgian line. Check, but good eye. My father trained search and rescue. She straightened, addressing both men. The briefing starts in 20 minutes. Full task force. Boone scoffed. Task force. 3 deputies, 2 rangers, and now you feds. Meanwhile, my grandson's still out there. Talia's expression softened slightly. We're going to find him, Chief. The old man's eyes drifted to the rain-streaked window, to the dark wall of pines beyond. Maybe, if the forest lets you. The briefing was standard. Search grids, communication protocols, chain of command. Nate half listened, focusing instead on memorizing faces and assessing capabilities. Most of the local deputies looked capable enough, if undertrained for, wilderness work. The 2 park rangers clearly knew the terrain but seemed unnervingly on edge. Talia led the briefing with methodical precision, but Nate caught the subtle tells, the slight furrow between her brows, the too careful neutrality. In her voice when discussing theories, she was holding something back. We deploy at first light, she concluded. Sergeant Halvorsen and Echo will take point on the eastern sector, where Lucas was last seen. Later, as the others filed out, Nate approached her. You didn't mention any theories on what's happening to these people? Because I don't have any. Not officially. Talia glanced around before lowering her voice. There have been reports of cognitive anomalies, disorientation, time loss, auditory hallucinations, all dismissed as panic or exposure. You think differently. I think there's a pattern. The forest here. She hesitated. Let's just say there's something about this area that interests certain research divisions. Sounds like conspiracy theory territory. Maybe. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. But I noticed you checking exits and sight lines since you arrived. Old habits from deployment, or are you feeling it too? Nate said nothing. He dismissed the prickling sensation at the base of his skull as hypervigilance, a souvenir from Afghanistan. But Echo had been on alert since they crossed the county line, her behavior subtly off in ways only he would notice. Get some rest. Sergeant, Talia said, gathering her files. Tomorrow will be a long day. Dawn broke gray and misty over the forest. Echo moved with confident precision through the underbrush, nose working the damp air. Nate followed, marking their path on GPS as they pushed deeper into the search area. 3 hours in, Echo stopped abruptly at a stand of ancient pines. Her ears flattened as she growled, a low, warning rumble he rarely heard outside of combat situations. What is it, girl? He murmured, scanning the area. Nothing but trees, ferns, moss. No movement, no sound. Even the birds had gone silent. Echo took 3 steps forward, then balked, hackles raised. She circled an empty patch of air, growling at nothing. Echo, come. She ignored the command, another rarity. Nate felt the first flutter of unease. He'd seen her track insurgents through sandstorms, locate IEDs in chaotic market streets, but he'd never seen her fixate on empty space. The crackle of his radio made him flinch. Any sign? Talia's voice distorted by static. Negative. Echoes. Acting strange, though, might have picked up something. A longer burst of static, then. Define strange. Nate watched as Echo continued circling, growling at thin air. She's alert to a threat I can't see. Refusing commands. A pause. Pull back to the rendezvous point, now. Something in her tone sent a cold trickle down his spine. Copy that. It took 3 attempts to get Echo to heel. As they retreated, Nate felt an odd pressure in his ears, like descending in an airplane. The sensation of being watched intensified with each step. She's reacting to something, Talia insisted as they huddled over maps back at base camp. The question is what? Dogs sense things we don't, Boone said, his voice flat. Doesn't mean anything supernatural. I didn't say supernatural. Talia tapped her tablet. But there have been documented cases of animals reacting to electromagnetic anomalies, infrasound. It's a waste of time, Boone cut her off. My grandson is missing and you're chasing ghost stories. The chief stalked away, leaving an uncomfortable silence. He's been through a lot, Talia said quietly. We all have. Nate studied the forest topography. What aren't you telling me? About this place? She hesitated. There are files. Reports dating back to the 50s. Similar disappearances, similar witness accounts. People describing thin spots in the woods, places where time slips. Nate nearly laughed. You can't be serious. I'm not asking you to believe in fairy tales, Sergeant. I'm asking you to keep an open mind. She met his gaze. What happened in Afghanistan? The question hit like a physical blow. Nate felt his jaw tighten. That's classified. Not all of it. Not the part where you reported seeing something impossible. The memory surfaced unbidden. The mountain pass, the ambush. Johnson lying motionless in the dirt. And the shapes moving in impossible ways through the dust. The way the air had bent around them. Stress-induced hallucination, he said flatly. Nothing more. Talia studied him for a long moment. If you say so. Later, sorting through recovered evidence, Nate found an old brass compass among Lucas's belongings. Its needle spun wildly when he held it near the forest edge, spinning faster when Echo began growling at the tree line again, at nothing visible in the gathering darkness. Night fell like a shroud over the camp. Nate lay awake, listening to the forest's susurration. A cold, rational part of his mind cataloged explanations for everything they'd experienced. Environmental factors, psychological suggestion, the power of terrain to distort perception. But another part, the part that had kept him alive in war, whispered that something was wrong here, something fundamental. A sudden movement jolted him upright. Echo stood tensed at the tent flap, staring into the darkness. Before he could react, she tore through the opening and bolted toward the trees. Echo. No response, just the sound of her crashing through undergrowth, heading for a point that didn't exist on any map. Nate grabbed his pack and flashlight and plunged after her deeper into the waiting dark. Echo! Nate crashed through the undergrowth, the beam of his flashlight slicing ineffectually through the mist that clung to the forest floor. Fallen branches snagged at his boots as he followed the sound of Echo's movement deeper into the trees. The rational part of his mind calculated distance and direction. They were heading northeast, away from the established search grid. The farther they moved from camp, the more the forest seemed to close in around them, branches interlocking overhead to blot out the stars. "Echo, halt!" he commanded, his voice sharp with authority that had never failed to stop her before. This time, there was no response but the continued sound of her progress through the woods. Nate thumbed his radio. "Base, this is Halvorsen. Echo's bolted northeast of camp. I'm in pursuit approximately half a mile in." Static answered him. He tried again, received the same white noise. With a muttered curse, he checked his GPS. The screen flickered, the blue dot of his position jumping erratically before disappearing entirely. No signal. "Perfect," he muttered, pocketing the useless device. The mist thickened as he pushed forward, his training automatically logging details, the absence of animal sounds, the unnatural stillness of the air, the way his footsteps seemed muffled, as if the forest were absorbing the sound. It reminded him of the mountains in Afghanistan, the eerie quiet before... No. He shut down that line of thought. This was nothing like that. This was a dog with a scent, a search and rescue operation, an explicable situation. A sharp bark cut through his thoughts. Echo's distinctive alert call, she'd found something. Nate broke into a run, pushing through a stand of young pines into what should have been just more forest. Instead, he found himself at the edge of a perfect circular clearing, perhaps 30 feet in diameter. The mist swirled at its edges but didn't enter the space. Echo stood at its center, hackles raised, barking at nothing. "Echo, come," he called, stepping into the clearing. The moment his boot touched the ground within the circle, the air changed. It became heavy, pressing against his eardrums with a sensation like being underwater. His flashlight dimmed, though the batteries were new. And there was something else, a sound at the edge of hearing, like voices whispering just below the threshold of comprehension. Not the same anymore, a voice seemed to say, though when Nate whipped around there was no one there. "Who's there?" he demanded, hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm he wasn't carrying. Echo whined, circling a specific spot in the clearing. She pawed at the ground, her behavior shifting from alert to anxious. Nate approached cautiously, the pressure in his ears intensifying with each step. The whispering grew louder, fragments coalescing into words. Convergence point, subject shows promise, increased dosage. A spike of pain lanced through Nate's skull. He stumbled, vertigo sending the world tilting around him. For an instant, the clearing seemed to shimmer, overlaid with the image of a sterile room, metal tables, figures in lab coats. Then it was gone, leaving him gasping. "What the hell?" he muttered, pressing the heels of his hands against his temples. Echo's frantic pawing had exposed something beneath the bed of pine needles covering the clearing floor. Nate knelt beside her, brushing away more of the detritus to reveal dull, rusted metal. He cleared more pine needles, uncovering the curved edge of what appeared to be a hatch, its surface dotted with faded yellow stenciling. Pro-JW Veil and restricted access. "Good girl," he murmured absently, running his fingers along the edge of the hatch looking for a handle or latch. His watch caught his eye as he worked, the digital display reading 2:17 a.m. That couldn't be right. He'd left camp just after 10:30 p.m. Even accounting for the time spent tracking Echo, it shouldn't be this late. The discovery sent a cold prickle down his spine. He'd been trained to maintain temporal awareness, a critical skill in operations. There was no way he'd lost track of nearly 4 hours, unless the forest was actually affecting his perception, as Talia had suggested. A low growl from Echo pulled his attention back to their surroundings. She was staring into the trees at the edge of the clearing, her body rigid with tension. Nate followed her gaze but saw nothing, yet the sense of being watched was overwhelming, raising the fine hairs on the back of his neck. The whispering voices returned louder now, a susurrus of overlapping words. Potential candidate, unexpected resistance, recalibrate the field. "Who's there?" he called again, his voice sounding strange in the heavy air. "This is a federal operation. Identify yourself." Only silence answered, but the pressure in his ears built until he could hear the blood rushing through his veins. Echo began to back away from the place she'd been fixated on, her growl shifting to a high-pitched whine of distress. "Easy, girl," Nate murmured, moving to her side, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. "We're okay." But they weren't okay. Something was very wrong here. Nate felt it in the hollow pit of his stomach, in the electric tingle at the base of his skull, the same warning system that had saved him from IEDs and ambushes. He needed to get back to camp, report what they'd found. He turned to leave the clearing, Echo pressing tight against his leg. 3 steps toward the tree line, the world warped. The mist swirled up from the ground, enveloping him in a cocoon of white. The whispering voices rose to a crescendo, no longer at the edge of hearing but surrounding him. Inside his head, distorted faces seemed to form in the mist, changing, melting, reforming. Among them, for just an instant, the face of his lost squadmate Johnson, mouth open in a silent scream. Nate staggered, disoriented. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, becoming insubstantial. He reached for Echo, found nothing but mist. Panic flared, alien and unwelcome in his disciplined mind. "Echo." His voice sounded distant, disconnected from his body. The last thing he felt was the sensation of falling, though there was nowhere to fall to. The last thing he heard was a voice, not whispering now, but clear and clinical. "Subject is experiencing full perceptual break. Remarkable resemblance to Muir's notes. This one might actually survive the process." Then darkness. "Halvorsen! Sergeant Halvorsen!" The voice penetrated the fog of unconsciousness. Nate struggled toward it, fighting through layers of disorientation. "Nate, can you hear me?" His eyes opened to daylight filtering through pine branches. Talia's face hovered above him, her expression taut with concern. He tried to sit up, found, his limbs leaden and unresponsive. "Easy," she said, a hand on his shoulder. "You've been out for a while." "Echo?" His voice was a rasp. "She's here. She led me to you." Talia gestured, and Echo moved into his field of vision, ears alert, watchful. Nate's mind struggled to process his surroundings. He was half buried in pine needles at the base of a massive tree. The clearing was gone. The hatch was gone. There was no sign they had ever existed. "What happened?" Talia asked, helping him to a sitting position. "You've been missing for 14 hours. "That's not possible." Nate checked his watch. The display read 12:45 p.m. "I left camp around 10:30 last night." "That was 2 nights ago, Nate." The words hit him like a physical blow. 2 days? His mind reeled, unable to account for the missing time. He'd experienced minutes of disorientation in the clearing, not days. There was a clearing, he said, trying to organize his thoughts. A metal hatch, military markings, Project something, Willowvale. Maybe. Talia's expression shifted subtly. You're sure? I know what I saw. Even as he said it, doubt crept in. Did he? The experience already felt dreamlike, insubstantial. Can you lead us back there? Her tone was careful, neutral. I don't know. Nate looked to Echo, who sat watching him with unblinking attention. There was something different in her gaze, something that hadn't been there before. Everything looks different in daylight. Talia helped him to his feet. His legs were unsteady, his head pounding with the worst migraine he'd ever experienced. We need to get you checked out, she said. Then we'll talk about what you found. As they made their slow way back toward base camp, Nate couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. In the forest, in Echo, in himself. The certainties he'd built his life around seemed suddenly fragile, like a thin shell over an abyss he'd glimpsed for just a moment. And somewhere in that abyss something was watching, waiting, learning. Back at camp, clean and warm with a mug of coffee in his steady hands, Nate listened as Talia laid out what came next. We need to find that hatch, she said, her voice low, enough that only he could hear. If it exists, it could explain everything. If, he repeated, an edge to his voice. You know how this sounds, Nate. He did. It sounded like the ravings of a man losing his grip on reality. But Echo had seen it too. Echo had led him there. Fine, he said after a long moment. We'll go back, but on my terms. With proper gear and daylight and with a clear exit plan. Talia's slight smile held no humor. Of course, Sergeant. We wouldn't want to get lost in the woods. But they both knew it was too late for that. They were already lost in something, far more complex than a forest, and the way out wasn't as simple as following a compass home. The hatch fought them, decades of rust fusing metal to metal. Nate leveraged the pry bar against the edge, muscles straining. Beside him, Talia braced her boot against the ground, adding her weight to the effort. You're sure Boone doesn't know about this? Nate grunted, shifting his grip. Talia shook her head. If he does, he never mentioned it in any official capacity. They had returned at dawn, just the two of them. Nate had insisted on keeping their discovery compartmentalized until they knew what they were dealing with. Finding the clearing, again, had been oddly simple. Echo had led them straight to it, though she now stood at its edge, refusing to enter. With a groan of protesting metal, the hatch finally gave way. Stale air rushed out, carrying a chemical smell that made Nate's nostrils burn. He aimed his flashlight into the darkness below, revealing a rusted ladder descending into a concrete shaft. Ladies first, he offered dryly. Talia arched an eyebrow. Age before beauty, Sergeant. The ladder creaked under his weight, but held. Nate descended carefully, counting the rungs, 27 before his boots touched solid ground. He swept his flashlight in an arc, revealing a corridor stretching into darkness. Clear, he called up. Talia joined him moments later, her own flashlight adding its beam to his. The corridor walls were lined with conduit piping and faded hazard warnings. Decades of moisture had taken their toll, with mold blooming in patches, and small stalactites forming where minerals leached through concrete. Cold War era, Talia murmured, brushing her fingers against a faded insignia on the wall. This would have been built during the height of government PSI research. Psi? Nate's skepticism was reflexive. Remote viewing, psychic phenomena, altered states of consciousness. Her light lingered on a rusted sign. Section 7, authorized personnel only. They were looking for ways to weaponize perception itself. And did they? Nate kept his voice neutral, though the prickling sensation at the base of his skull had returned. Talia's smile didn't reach her eyes. Officially? No. But then we're standing in a facility that officially doesn't exist. At the corridor junction, Echo whined from above, her barks echoing down the shaft. She's spooked, Nate observed, feeling a tug of unease. Echo didn't spook easily. "Can't say I blame her," Talia replied, her light illuminating a metal door with a shattered window. "Let's start here. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The room beyond had once been an office. Filing cabinets lay toppled, their contents scattered across a floor carpeted with decades of decay. A desk remained upright in one corner, its surface covered with dust and fallen ceiling tiles. Talia moved purposefully to the cabinets, pulling open drawers that protested with metallic screeches. Look for anything labeled Willow Vale or Convergent Studies. Nate began sorting through papers. Most crumbled at his touch. Many had been damaged by water, the ink bleeding into illegibility. Others contained strings of numbers and code names. That meant nothing to him. "Here," Talia called, her voice pitched with excitement. She held up a moisture-sealed case labeled Project Willow Veal, subject audio logs. Nate joined her as she opened the case, revealing rows of small reel-to-reel tapes, each dated and numbered. "Portable reel recorder," she muttered, scanning the room. "There must be one somewhere." They found it in the next chamber, a laboratory space dominated by what appeared to be medical equipment. Rusted gurneys lined one wall, beside cabinets, still stocked with ancient medication vials. An observation window looked into a smaller room containing a single chair bolted to the floor. "What the hell were they doing here?" Nate whispered, a chill working its way up his spine. "Let's find out." Talia dusted off the reel recorder, checking its components. "Battery's dead, but it looks like there's a hand crank." She threaded the earliest tape through the machine and began turning the crank. Static hissed, then a man's voice emerged, thin and wavering. "Dr. Owen Muir, Project Willowvale, Entry 1. The convergence zones first documented by Ericsson's team appear to be intensifying. Local reports of missing time and spatial anomalies correlate with our instrumentation. Something about this forest amplifies and reflects consciousness itself. We've established the primary facility at Convergence Point Alpha, where the effect is strongest." The voice cut off, replaced by more static. Talia cranked faster until it returned. "Subjects report identical hallucinations when exposed to the zone. They describe thinning of reality, perceptual bleeding between observer and environment. Most disturbing are the consistent reports of presences, entities that seem to exist at the periphery of awareness. Are they manifestations of the subject's unconscious or something more? The military applications are obvious, but the risks..." More static. Nate found himself holding his breath, straining to hear. Talia's face was wrapped, illuminated in the harsh beam of their flashlights. "Discovered that prolonged exposure creates a feedback loop between perception and place. The observer changes the environment, but the environment also changes the observer. Subject 4 showed remarkable adaptation, but the psychological fragmentation in later stages became unmanageable. We've had to terminate." The tape ended, abruptly. Talia reached for the next one in sequence, but Nate caught her wrist. "We need to think about what we're doing here," he said quietly. "Whatever they were researching, it went wrong. We could be exposing ourselves to the same effects." "That's exactly the point," Talia replied, a feverish light in her eyes. "Don't you see? These convergence zones must be what's causing the disappearances. What happened to you in the clearing? It was documented here decades ago." Before Nate could respond, a sound echoed from deeper in the facility, a metallic clang, like a door closing. They froze, lights aimed down the darkened corridor. "Echo?" Nate called, hoping the dog had somehow followed them down. Silence answered, then a faint scraping sound like footsteps. Nate unholstered his sidearm, moving instinctively to place himself between Talia and the unknown. They advanced slowly, following the source of the sound. The corridor opened into a larger chamber filled with what appeared to be monitoring equipment. Banks of analog readouts lined the walls, their displays dark and lifeless. In the center of the room, a console still glowed with a single red light. Beside it lay a leather-bound journal, its pages open as if recently consulted. Talia reached for it, her hand trembling slightly. This is Muir's personal journal, she whispered, scanning the pages. He was documenting the effects on himself. Listen to this. The forest knows us now. It learns from each observer, builds a composite understanding of human consciousness. The zones are like two-way mirrors. We peer in, thinking we're watching something else, never realizing we're really watching distorted reflections of ourselves. A flicker of movement caught Nate's eye, a shadow passing across the doorway they'd entered through. He spun, weapon raised but found only empty space. "There's someone else down here," he hissed. Talia nodded toward the floor. In the dust, a set of small footprints was clearly visible, the size of a teenager's. "Lucas," she suggested. Nate crouched to examine them. "Fresh, within the last hour." He looked up at Talia. "How would a missing kid survive down here for weeks?" Before she could answer, their radios crackled with sudden static. Nate's watch began to malfunction, the digital display flickering between random times. The pressure returned to his ears, that sense of being underwater, of reality thinning around him. "We need to move," he said, but his voice sounded distorted, as if coming from far away. Echo's frantic barking echoed down the shaft, suddenly cut short. Talia didn't seem to notice his urgency. She was absorbed in Muir's journal, flipping pages with increasing agitation. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew what would happen. Listen. The zones are expanding. Each interaction accelerates the process. We thought we were studying it, but it's been studying us all along. Learning, adapting. Soon the entire forest will become a convergence point, and then..." She looked up, her face pale in the harsh light. The next entry is dated 3 weeks later. It just says, "I understand. Now, God help us all." The final page contained only a set of coordinates, written in a shaky hand. "These are deeper in the forest," Talia said, her voice hushed with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Way off any official trail." Nate's every instinct screamed to retreat, to put this place behind them and never return. But the memory of Johnson's face in the mist haunted him, the same expression of terror he'd seen in Afghanistan. And now Lucas's footprints leading them deeper. "We should call for backup," he said, knowing even as he spoke that it wasn't an option. How would they explain this place, what they'd found? They'd be pulled from the investigation immediately. "Nate," Talia said softly, "I think these coordinates might be where we'll find Lucas." He met her gaze, seeing his own fear and fascination mirrored there. After a long moment, he nodded. "All right, but first we get out of here, regroup, and come back properly equipped." He glanced at his malfunctioning watch. "Whatever's happening, to time and space down here, I don't want to push our luck." As they made their way back to the entrance shaft, Nate couldn't shake the feeling they were being followed. Not by something physical, but by an awareness that permeated the facility itself. An intelligence that was perhaps older and vaster than the human minds that had tried to study it. Echo was waiting at the top, her posture rigid with tension. For the first time since Nate had known her, she backed away when he approached, maintaining a careful distance until they were well clear of the clearing. Dawn painted the treetops with pale gold as Nate checked his pack for the third time. Extra batteries, water, first aid, emergency blanket, flares. His hand lingered on the compass, the old brass one from Lucas's belongings. Its needle spun, lazily, never settling on true north. "Ready?" Talia approached, her own pack slung over her shoulder. Dark circles beneath her eyes suggested she'd slept as poorly as he had. Nate nodded, clipping Echo's lead to her tactical harness. The German Shepherd stood alert but maintained a strange new distance from him, not quite pulling away but not pressing against his leg as she normally would. "You told Boone we're following a lead?" he asked as they set out. "Something like that." Talia consulted her GPS where she'd programmed Muir's coordinates. "I didn't mention the facility, or the tapes." They moved in silence through the morning mist, the forest unnaturally quiet around them. No bird song, no rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. Just the soft crunch of pine needles beneath their boots and their measured breathing. And hour in, Nate noticed the first carving, a crude symbol etched into the bark of an ancient pine, a circle with a vertical line through its center. "Talia," he called softly. She examined it, fingers tracing the weathered grooves. Old. Decades. Maybe, marking a trail or a boundary. They found more symbols as they continued, each slightly different, some fresher than others. Echo sniffed at them cautiously, her ears flicking back and forth as if catching sounds beyond human hearing. The coordinates led them deeper into the forest, to areas that didn't appear on any Park Service map. The terrain grew increasingly difficult, the pines giving way to older, stranger growth, trees twisted into unnatural shapes, fungi blooming in vivid colors along fallen trunks. "Check the GPS," Nate said as they paused at a small stream to refill their water bottles. "How much farther?" Talia frowned at the screen. "According to this, we've barely moved in the last hour, but that can't be right." Nate surveyed their surroundings, a cold suspicion forming. What if it is right? What if we've been walking in circles? That's impossible. We've been following a straight line. Yet when they continued, the landscape began to take on a strange familiarity. Nate recognized a lightning-struck tree they'd passed an hour before. Then a distinctive rock formation. The same stream. "We're looping," he said, stopping abruptly. "The forest is folding somehow." Talia's scientific skepticism warred visibly with what her own senses told her. That's not physically possible. Neither is what happened in that clearing, or the time loss. Nate's hand went to his sidearm, though he knew it would be useless against whatever they were facing. Muir's journal mentioned perception affecting the environment. What if it works both ways? Echo whined, then suddenly growled. Not at the forest, but at Nate himself. Before he could react, she yanked her lead from his hand and bolted into the trees. "Echo!" he called, starting after her. "Nate, wait!" Talia grabbed his arm. "Listen." The forest had fallen completely silent. No wind, no distant sounds of wildlife. Just a presence, pressing against his eardrums like the moment before a thunderclap. Then, a voice. "Halvorsen." Nate froze. He knew that voice, had heard it in his nightmares for months. "Johnson," he whispered. A figure stood between the trees ahead, a soldier in desert camo, face shadowed beneath a helmet. Exactly as Nate had last seen him, moments before the ambush in that Afghan mountain pass. "You left me there." Johnson's voice carried no echo, as if the forest swallowed the sound. "You saw them coming and you did nothing." "You were already dead," Nate said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "There was nothing I could do." "Was I?" Johnson stepped forward, his face coming into view, pale, accusing. "Or did you run because you saw something you couldn't explain, something that didn't fit into your orderly world?" Talia's hand tightened on Nate's arm. "Who are you talking to?" she whispered, her voice taut with fear. Nate glanced at her. "You don't see him?" "See who?" Her eyes searched the trees, seeing nothing but shadow and mist. When Nate looked back, Johnson was gone. But the accusation lingered, vibrating in his bones. Had he abandoned his friend? Had what he'd seen in Afghanistan, those impossible shapes moving through the dust, driven him to retreat when he might have saved Johnson? "It's targeting our perceptions individually," Talia said, her voice clinical, despite her obvious distress. "I can hear my doctoral advisor critiquing my research, telling me I'm delusional, that this is why my career failed." She pulled a small device from her pocket, an EMF meter, its needle pinned to the maximum reading. "Whatever's causing these hallucinations, it's generating a massive electromagnetic field, focused somehow, directed at our brains specifically." A bark drew their attention. Echo had returned, something clutched in her jaws. She dropped it at Talia's feet, a torn piece of red fabric. "That's from Lucas's hoodie," Talia said, picking it up. "He was wearing it in the last photos before he disappeared." The fabric was dirty but not weathered. It hadn't been exposed to the elements for long, Talia held it out to Echo, who sniffed it, then turned and loped away again, clearly expecting them to follow. This time they did. Echo led them through a series of switchbacks that seemed to defy the geography they'd observed. Trees they shouldn't have been able to circle around opened into new clearings. Distances compressed and expanded irrationally. They emerged into a small depression in the forest floor, centered around the charred remains of a campfire. Around it, scattered bones gleamed white against the dark earth. Small animals, mostly, but a few larger fragments that Nate refused to examine too closely. "Someone's been here recently," he said, crouching beside the fire pit. The ashes were cold, but not weathered. Talia circled the site, her EMF meter buzzing continuously. "The readings are off the scale here. It's like we're standing in the middle of a microwave." Nate felt it too, the pressure building in his skull, the whispers at the edge of hearing. Echo paced the perimeter, alternating between growls and whines of distress. "There," Talia pointed to a flat stone beside the fire pit. Beneath it, the corner of a paper was visible. Nate carefully lifted the stone. Beneath it lay a torn page from a spiral notebook, the handwriting cramped and urgent. "Day 7, I think. Time doesn't work right here. I keep seeing things that aren't possible. Dad when he was young, Mom before she left, people I've never met, who seem to know me. The voices say it's normal. They say I'm adapting to the convergence. There are others here, but they're not always solid. They flicker like bad reception. Dr. M says we're in a place where thoughts become real. He's been here since the 60s, but he doesn't look old. Says time is different in the deeper zones." I found a way to the center. The symbols are a map if you know how to read them, but something follows me now. It looks like a dog sometimes. Other times, something else. If anyone finds this, don't follow the echo. It's not her anymore. She's just a shape they're using, like they use all our memories. They learn from us. They become what we expect. I think I can get out through the second facility. There's another way in." The writing ended abruptly as if Lucas had been interrupted. "What does he mean, not her anymore?" Talia asked, looking at Echo, who stood unnaturally still at the edge of the clearing, watching them with an intensity that raised the hairs on Nate's neck. Before he could answer, Echo's head snapped towards something in the trees. She barked once, a sharp warning sound, then bounded away again. "Echo!" Nate called, but she was already gone. The pressure in his skull intensified. Johnson appeared, again at the edge of his vision, more solid this time. Beside him, Talia clutched her head, eyes squeezed shut against whatever she was experiencing. "We need to leave," Nate said, taking her arm. "Now." But as they turned, they found Echo blocking their path. She growled, hackles raised, eyes reflecting the dappled sunlight in a way that seemed wrong somehow, too bright, too knowing. "Echo, heel," Nate commanded, his voice firm despite his growing unease. She took a step forward, still growling, then stopped, head cocked as if listening to something. For a moment her form seemed to waver like heat rising from asphalt. Then she turned and raced into the trees, leaving them alone with the whispers and the bones and the warning scratched in desperate handwriting. "Don't follow the echo. It's not her anymore." The campfire cast long shadows across their makeshift monitoring station. Nate adjusted the trail camera for the third time, aiming it at the area where the EMF readings were strongest. Around them, the forest had grown dense with night, the darkness between trees absolute. "Is it recording?" Talia asked, not looking up from her tablet. She'd spent hours setting up sensors around the perimeter of what she called the hot zone, the area where reality seemed most malleable. Green lights on. Nate didn't mention his doubts that any electronic equipment would function normally here. Already their radios had failed, emitting only bursts of static that sometimes arranged themselves into words that made his skin crawl. Echo lay at the edge of the firelight as far from Nate as she could get while remaining visible. She hadn't approached him since their return from the bone-strewn clearing, watching him with wary eyes that reflected the flames too brightly. "You should try to sleep," Talia said, finally looking up. Shadows deepened the hollows of her face. "I'll monitor for the first shift." Nate doubted sleep would come, but he nodded and retreated to his tent. Inside, he lay awake, listening to the unnatural silence of the forest. No nocturnal creatures, no rustling leaves, just emptiness, as if the world ended at the edge of their camp. When sleep finally took him, it delivered no rest. In his dreams, he walked the forest again, but everything was backwards, mirror reversed. Through the trees, he glimpsed another version of himself watching. This other Nate was gaunt, hollow-eyed, moving with a predatory grace that felt wrong. When their eyes met, the other Nate smiled, a stretched, unnatural expression that revealed too many teeth. He woke with a gasp to find Echo standing at the entrance of his tent, silhouetted against the gray dawn. For a moment, he thought she'd come to make peace. Then he realized she was growling, low and continuous, her eyes fixed on his face. "Echo," he whispered, reaching out slowly. She backed away, still growling, then turned and vanished into the mist. Outside, Talia hunched over her equipment, her face pale with fatigue and frustration. "None of it works," she said without looking up. "Every recording corrupts. The sensors register impossible readings, then fail completely." Nate peered over her shoulder at the tablet display. The video from the trail camera showed their camp, but the images were wrong. Figures moved through the frame that hadn't been there, shadowy, indistinct forms that seemed to watch the camera. Worse, when Talia or Nate appeared in frame, their faces stretched and distorted, features melting into unrecognizable patterns. Timestamps jumped wildly, showing hours that couldn't have passed, dates decades in the past. "It's observing us," Talia murmured. "Whatever this phenomenon is, it's aware, interactive." "You mean it's intelligent?" The idea sent a cold trickle down Nate's spine. "I mean it responds to being observed, like a quantum particle changing behavior when measured." She rubbed her eyes. "But the scale is all wrong. This is happening at the macro level, affecting our whole perception of reality." A twig snapped in the forest beyond their camp. Nate's hand went to his sidearm as a figure emerged from the trees, but it was only Chief Boone, looking haggard and determined. "Been following your trail since yesterday," the older man said, dropping his pack beside the fire. "Not easy when it keeps changing behind you." "How did you find us?" Nate asked, offering him a cup of coffee from their portable stove. Boone took it with a nod of thanks. "These." He pulled a folded paper from his jacket, a hand-drawn map covered in the same symbols they'd seen carved into trees. "My grandfather's. He was part of the search team in '57 when the first batch of people went missing. He copied these from... The trees said they were a way to navigate the thin spots." Talia studied the map with newfound respect. "You knew about the facility." It wasn't a question, but Boone nodded anyway. "Rumors, stories. Nothing concrete until you two started asking questions. Then I pulled some old county records." He looked up, meeting Nate's gaze. "What have you stirred up out here, Sergeant?" Nate hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Something that's been waiting for a long time. Something that learns from us, uses what it finds in our heads." "What happened in Afghanistan?" Talia asked softly. "The thing you saw that you couldn't explain, it's connected to this, isn't it?" The question hung in the silence. Boone watched him with keen eyes, waiting. "We were in a mountain pass," Nate finally said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth after so long keeping them locked away. "Routine patrol, then ambush. Johnson went down first. I saw him fall." He paused, the memory vivid and terrible. But there was something else there. Not insurgents. Something moving in the dust. Shapes that folded, like they existed in extra dimensions. When they touched Johnson, what was left of him, he changed. Started moving again, but wrong. Looking at me with eyes that weren't his anymore. "And Echo?" Talia prompted gently. "She went nuts." Wouldn't go near Johnson's body, kept trying to drag me away. Nate stared into the fire. I let her, reported an ambush, casualties. Never mentioned what I really saw. They'd have pulled me for psych eval immediately. Boone nodded slowly. My brother saw something similar. Before he vanished in '57, said there were people who weren't people in the deep woods. No one believed him. An unexpected kinship formed between them in that moment. Men who had carried unbelievable truths alone for too long. The thing is, Nate continued, what I'm seeing here, what Echo is responding to, it's the same. Whatever was in that Afghan mountain pass is here in these woods. Or something that works the same way, Talia suggested. Dr. Muir's research, he was studying perceptual phenomena, how consciousness interacts with reality. What if he found something fundamental? A property of reality we don't understand yet? Their conversation was interrupted by Echo's bark, sharp, alerting. She had returned and stood rigid at the edge of camp, staring into the trees. All three turned to look. At first there was nothing. Then Nate noticed a subtle distortion in the air, like heat ripples on summer asphalt. Within it, a voice, faint, but distinct. "Grandpa, is that you?" Boone's coffee mug shattered on the ground. "Lucas?" he called, his voice breaking. He took a step toward the distortion, then another. "Wait," Nate grabbed his arm. "It might not be what it seems." But Boone shook him off, moving toward the voice with desperate hope written across his weathered face. "Lucas, where are you, boy?" It's hard to explain." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "It's like I'm in the same place, but sideways." As Boone approached the distortion, it shimmered more intensely. For just a moment, Nate thought he saw a face within it. A young man with Boone's eyes, looking scared and much older than 17. "I've been trying to get home," Lucas's voice continued, fading in and out like a bad radio signal. "But something follows me. It wears faces, it pretends." Boone reached the edge of the distortion and stopped, his hand outstretched toward the shimmer. "I'm coming to get you, Lucas." "No." The shout was forceful enough to make them all flinch. "Don't come deeper. Find the other way out. The second entrance." The shimmering intensified, then collapsed in on itself with a sound like glass cracking. Boone fell to his knees, his hand still reaching for where his grandson's voice had been. Talia approached him cautiously while Nate hung back, watching Echo. The German shepherd was tracking something invisible around the perimeter of their camp, her movements tense and predatory. "He said second entrance," Talia said quietly, helping Boone to his feet. "The journal mentioned it too." "This way," Boone said, his voice hollow but determined. He pointed to a rise beyond their camp, barely visible through the trees. "The old maps show something there. An access point, maybe." It took them less than an hour to find it, a concrete bunker entrance half hidden by vegetation, its metal door rusted but intact. Fresh scratches marred the surface around the handle, as if someone had recently forced it open. "Lucas," Boone whispered, touching the marks. Nate examined the door carefully. "These aren't from tools. They look like..." He hesitated, unwilling to voice what he was seeing. "Claws," Talia finished for him, her scientific certainty finally shaken. "They look like claw marks." Echo approached the door cautiously, sniffing. She whined once, then backed away, looking from the bunker to Nate with an expression that seemed almost human in its complexity. Fear, recognition, warning. The three humans exchanged glances, a silent understanding passing between them. Whatever waited beyond that door might explain everything or destroy them completely. "We need to know," Talia said softly. "For Lucas, for all of them." Boone nodded grimly. "I'm going in there regardless." Nate looked at Echo one last time, seeing the distance that had grown between them, a gulf of understanding neither could cross. If this Echo was still his Echo, at all. "Then we go together," he said, reaching for the handle. The bunker door opened with a reluctant groan, revealing a concrete stairwell descending into darkness. Stale air rushed past them, carrying the same chemical scent they'd encountered in the first facility. Nate's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating walls covered in the now familiar symbols they'd seen carved into trees. "I'll take point," Nate said, feeling the weight of his service weapon against his hip. Echo stood at the top of the stairs, refusing to enter despite his commands. "She won't come," Boone observed, his own flashlight joining Nate's. "Smart dog." They descended, single file, Nate then Talia with Boone bringing up the rear. The stairwell curved as it dropped, disorienting them. By the time they reached the bottom, Nate had lost all sense of direction. Unlike the first facility, this bunker hummed with subdued energy. Dim emergency lights still functioned, casting everything in a sickly amber glow. The corridor ahead branched in 3 directions, each identical. "We need to mark our path," Talia said, producing a piece of chalk. She drew an arrow on the wall, pointing back toward the stairs. "Lucas," Boone called, his voice echoing oddly, seeming to return from multiple directions at once. Nate raised a hand for silence. "Listen." Beneath the ambient hum of equipment, a whisper of sound reached them, something between static and voices, coming from the rightmost corridor. They followed it cautiously, Talia marking their path at each junction. The corridor ended at a heavy metal door labeled Observation Suite B. Inside, they found a room divided by what appeared to be a large one-way mirror. On their side, monitoring equipment, chairs, recording devices. On the other, a sterile white chamber, empty except for a single metal chair bolted to the floor. "What were they watching?" Boone asked, approaching the glass. "Not what," Talia said, her voice hushed. "Who?" Nate moved closer to the glass, drawn by something he couldn't articulate. His reflection stared back, but as he watched, it changed subtly. The reflected Nate's expression shifted independently, mouth curving into that too-wide smile from his dream. The reflection raised a hand to the glass while the real Nate stood frozen. "Talia," he whispered, "do you see that?" Before she could answer, the lights flickered. When they stabilized, the chamber beyond the glass was no longer empty. Echo sat in the center of the room, watching them with unblinking eyes. But Echo was also outside at the top of the stairs. Nate was certain of it. "It's not real," he said, as much to himself as to the others. The Echo in the chamber cocked her head as if considering his words. Then, with deliberate slowness, she began to change. Her form shimmered, stretched, became something else. A shadow figure with Johnson's face, then a creature of angles that hurt to look at, then Echo again. "Jesus Christ," Boone breathed. Talia approached the glass, scientific curiosity temporarily, overriding fear. "It's responding to our perceptions, becoming what we expect or fear." The moment she touched the glass, the chamber shifted again. Now they saw themselves inside, perfect duplicates standing frozen in the white room, staring back. As they watched in horror, the duplicates began to move wrongly, jerkily, like puppets with tangled strings. A sharp bark behind them made all 3 spin around. Echo, the real Echo, had followed them down after all. She stood in the doorway, growling at the glass, at their reflections, at everything. Nate stepped toward her. "Easy, girl." Echo lunged, not at him, but at Talia. Teeth bared. Nate barely managed to grab her harness, wrestling to restrain her as she snarled and snapped. "Echo, stand down," he commanded, shocked by her aggression. For a moment, Echo's eyes met his, and Nate saw something that chilled him to the core: recognition, intelligence, and a deeply alien quality that had never been there before. Then it was gone, replaced by canine confusion and distress. "What the hell was that?" Talia gasped, pressed against the wall as far from Echo as possible. "I don't know," Nate admitted, keeping a firm grip on Echo's harness. "She's never—" His voice trailed off as he noticed something on a desk in the corner. A child's drawing done in crayon on yellowed paper. It showed 3 stick figures standing before what appeared to be a window, with a dog at their feet. Behind the window, twisted shapes reached toward them, in a child's uneven handwriting at the bottom, Lucas B., age 6. "This is impossible," Boone said, taking the drawing with trembling hands. "Lucas was never here as a child. This facility was abandoned decades before he was born." "The date," Talia pointed to the corner of the drawing. "July 15th, 1992. "That's not possible," Boone repeated. "That's the day Lucas was born." The implications hung in the air between them. Time wasn't linear here. Cause and effect were scrambled, overlapping. The white chamber beyond the glass shifted again, this time showing a familiar clearing in the forest, the one with the bone-strewn fire pit. Within it, a teenage boy huddled beside a small flame. Lucas. Boone pressed his hands against the glass. "Lucas!" The boy didn't react, couldn't hear them. But something else in the image did. A shadow detached itself from the trees, approaching the boy from behind. A shape that was almost human, almost familiar. Nate felt Echo tense beside him, a continuous growl rumbling in her chest. The shadow in the image turned, as if looking directly at them through time and space, and Nate knew with terrible certainty that it saw them watching. The lights failed completely. In the darkness, Talia screamed, a sound of pure animal terror that Nate had heard only in combat zones. By the time he fumbled his flashlight on, she was on her knees, hands pressed to her temples. "Make it stop," she whimpered. "Please make it stop." "What do you see?" Nate knelt beside her while Boone kept his light trained on Echo, who paced in agitated circles. "Everything," Talia gasped. "All at once. My childhood, my future, deaths that haven't happened, lives I never lived." Her eyes were unfocused, seeing something beyond the room. "It's too much. Too many patterns, too many connections." Nate pulled her to her feet. "We need to get out. Now." They stumbled from the room, Boone supporting Talia while Nate controlled Echo with difficulty. The corridors had changed, Talia's chalk marks now pointing in impossible directions. Twice they found themselves back at the observation room despite taking different turns. "It's a loop," Boone said, desperation edging his voice. "We're trapped in a goddamn loop." "No," Nate's military training reasserted itself. "There's always a way out. We just need to think differently." He studied the symbols on the walls, remembering Lucas's journal. "The symbols are a map if you know how to read them. They weren't random. They were navigation markers for a space that didn't follow normal rules." "This way," he said with more confidence than he felt, leading them down a corridor they'd avoided before. After what seemed like hours of wandering, they found another stairwell. It looked identical to the one they'd entered by, every detail the same. With no better options, they ascended, emerging through a bunker door into the forest. But it wasn't the same place they'd entered. The vegetation was different, the time of day wrong. According to Talia's GPS, which briefly functioned before dying completely, they were nearly 5 miles from their entry point. "How is that possible?" Boone asked, leaning against a tree, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "I don't think it is," Talia said, her voice steadier now though her eyes remained haunted. "I think the forest is folding somehow, connecting points that shouldn't connect." Nate checked his watch. 10:47 a.m. Yet they'd entered the bunker at 10:47 m. Despite what felt like hours inside, no time had passed in the world above. "Your brother," he said to Boone. "When he disappeared in 57, did he ever mention seeing himself? Reflections that moved on their own?" Boone's weathered face tightened. He said there was another version of him in the woods, watching, waiting to take his place. His eyes drifted to Echo, who stood apart from the group, watching the trees. Said his dog stopped recognizing him days before he vanished for good. A chill settled over the group. Nate looked at Echo, remembering her aggression toward Talia, the alien intelligence he'd glimpsed in her eyes. Was she still his Echo? Had she ever been since they entered this forest? "I think whatever Lucas saw in that chamber," Talia said slowly, "whatever's watching us through these convergence zones, It doesn't just observe. It absorbs, learns, replaces. A sound echoed through the trees, a voice calling from somewhere ahead. "Hello? Is someone there? I can hear you." All three froze, recognizing the voice immediately. "Lucas." "Lucas?" Boone broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush toward the voice. Nate and Talia followed, with Echo trailing at an uncharacteristic distance. They found him in a small clearing, leaning against a fallen log. Lucas Boone, but not the 17-year-old boy from the photos. This Lucas was older, mid-20s at least, with a patchy beard and haunted eyes that had seen too much. His red hoodie hung in tatters from his gaunt frame. "Grandpa?" Lucas's voice cracked as Boone rushed forward to embrace him. "You're really here?" "My God, Lucas." Boone pulled back, hands gripping his grandson's shoulders as he studied the aged face. "What happened to you? You've been missing less than 2 months." A brittle laugh escaped Lucas. "Time's just another thing that bends here. I've been walking these woods for years. At least it feels that way." His gaze drifted over Boone's shoulder to Nate and Talia. "I've been watching you, all of you, for days." "That's not possible," Talia said. "We just arrived in this part of the forest. Everything's possible here." Lucas's attention fixed on Echo, who remained at the edge of the clearing. Hackles raised. "She led me to the center. Did you know that? Your dog, but she's not the same anymore." Nate felt a chill that had nothing to do with the forest's damp air. "What do you mean?" "She found me after I got lost. Guided me to the old buildings, the places where the walls are thin." Lucas's eyes never left Echo. "I thought she was a search dog at first. Then I realized she was something wearing a dog's shape. Using memories, mine, yours, everyone who's been lost here." A heavy silence fell over the group. Nate looked at Echo, trying to see her through new eyes, the subtle wrongness that had been growing since they entered the forest, the distance, the flashes of something alien behind her familiar gaze. "You've seen Dr. Muir?" Talia asked, breaking the silence. Lucas nodded. "Or what's left of him. He never left, you know. Couldn't. He's part of the forest now, part of the convergence. He tried to study it, but it absorbed him instead." "Absorbed?" Talia's scientific skepticism warred visibly with the evidence of her own eyes. A boy aged years and months, speaking of impossibilities with calm certainty. The zones are like filters. Reality passes through them and gets changed. Lucas gestured vaguely at the surrounding trees. "Muir found a way to record messages, warnings. There should be one nearby. He scattered them throughout the forest for anyone who might come looking." As if summoned by his words, a crackle of static emanated from a fallen log several feet away. Talia approached cautiously, finding a small device half buried in moss, a weatherproof recorder. Its casing cracked but still functioning. When she pressed play, Muir's voice emerged, stronger than on the previous tapes but distorted with an echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "If you're hearing this, you've entered Convergence Zone Delta, the deepest point, the place where observation and reality become indistinguishable. We thought we were the observers, the scientists, the ones in control. We were wrong. It was observing us all along, learning from each mind it touched. Human consciousness became the variable, the catalyst. And now..." A long pause, filled with the sound of labored breathing. "You are the variable now. Your perceptions are reshaping this place even as it reshapes you. Choose carefully what you believe is real. It will become so." The recording ended with a burst of static that made them all flinch. "What does he mean, or choose what you believe is real?" Nate asked, looking between Lucas and Talia. "He means reality is subjective here," Lucas replied. "Malleable. What you expect to see, you'll see. What you fear, you'll find." A low growl pulled their attention to Echo. She stood rigid, staring past them into the trees. When Nate turned to look, he saw nothing. But Boone gasped. "Michael?" The old man's voice was barely a whisper. "You see him?" Lucas asked, unsurprised. My brother. Just like the day he disappeared. Boone took a step toward whatever phantom he perceived. Grandpa, don't! Lucas grabbed his arm. It's not him, it's never who you think it is. But Boone shook him off, moving as if in a trance toward the trees. Michael, wait for me this time. Before anyone could stop him, he plunged into the forest, following a ghost only he could see. Boone. Nate started after him, but Lucas blocked his path. Let him go, the forest has him now. His eyes were hollow with acceptance. It always gets what it wants in the end. That's his brother, Talia said. His brother who disappeared. In 1957, how could he see him? Because Michael never left either, Lucas explained. None of us ever really leave, we just transform, become part of the pattern. Something in his tone made Nate's skin crawl. He studied Lucas more carefully, noting the strange stillness in his movements, the way his eyes reflected the dappled sunlight too brightly, just like echoes. You're not Lucas, he said softly. Not anymore. A sad smile crossed the young man's face. I was. Most of me still is. But there's something else now too, something older. It needed a voice you'd listen to. Echo barked sharply, an alert sound Nate recognized from countless missions. But this time she was alerting on Lucas. I can show you the way out, Lucas continued, ignoring Echo's growing agitation. There's a path through the deepest zone, but you have to leave your perception of self behind, your attachments. His gaze shifted meaningfully to Echo. The German shepherd growled, then suddenly lunged, not at Lucas but at Nate himself. Her teeth snapped inches from his throat as he stumbled backward, shocked by the attack. Echo, stand down, he commanded, falling back on years of training. For a moment she hesitated, whining as if in pain. Something flickered behind her eyes. Recognition, confusion, a silent plea. Then it was gone, replaced by that alien coldness he'd glimpsed in the observation chamber. She's fighting it, Lucas observed clinically. Interesting. The bond must be stronger than usual. Echo backed away, circling the clearing, her movements jerky and unnatural. One moment she seemed like the loyal partner Nate had known for years. The next, something wearing Echo's shape but moving all wrong. Talia backed toward Nate, her voice low. We need to leave, now. There's nowhere to go, Lucas replied, though she hadn't been speaking to him. The convergence is spreading. Soon the entire forest will be a zone of altered reality. The air around them began to shimmer, the trees bending at impossible angles. Nate saw Johnson again, standing just beyond Lucas. Talia gasped, evidently seeing her own phantom. The forest was fracturing around them, each person experiencing a different version of reality. You have to choose, Lucas said, his form beginning to waver like heat ripples. Trust your eyes, or trust what you know? Echo circled back, stopping, several feet from Nate. In her jaws she held something, a weathered compass. Lucas's compass. She dropped it at his feet, then backed away, watching him with that unsettling gaze that was both Echo and not Echo. Nate picked up the compass. Its needle spun wildly, then suddenly stopped, pointing deeper into the forest, away from the direction Boone had taken, away from the shimmering phantom surrounding them. Trust Echo? Lucas's voice had changed, deepening, taking on the clinical tone of Dr. Muir. Or trust your instincts, Sergeant. She led you into this. She's been changed by it. Corrupted. Echo whined, a sound so achingly familiar that Nate felt his resolve waver. She had saved his life multiple times, been his constant companion through the darkest moments of his military career. If any bond could withstand this corruption, surely theirs could. But he remembered Johnson's face in the Afghan dust, the way his dead squad mate had moved after the shapes touched him, the cold certainty that whatever looked through Johnson's eyes in those final moments hadn't been human. Nate. Talia's voice was strained. I'm seeing too much. Too many versions all at once. He turned to find her on her knees, blood trickling from her nose, eyes unfocused. The forest's effect was overwhelming her analytical mind, showing her infinite permutations of reality simultaneously. "Go," Lucas said, his form continuing to shift between young boy, haggard man, and something else entirely. "Follow either Echo or the compass, but decide quickly. The zone is collapsing." As if to emphasize his point, a tremendous crack echoed through the forest. Trees began to bend toward the center of the clearing, space itself seeming to fold inward, like a closing fist. Echo barked once, then turned and ran into the trees in the exact direction the compass pointed. Nate made his choice. With one last look at Lucas and a silent apology to Talia, he plunged into the forest after Echo, chasing the only constant he had left in a world coming undone. Nate ran until his lungs burned, following Echo's fleeting form through a forest that increasingly defied comprehension. Trees grew sideways, then upside down. The ground rippled like water beneath his feet. The sky, visible through the canopy, shifted between day and night in eye blinks. Echo never slowed, never looked back. Just a flash of fur, always at the edge, of vision, leading him deeper. After what felt like hours or seconds, time had lost all meaning. The trees abruptly ended. Nate stumbled into a perfect circular clearing unlike any he'd seen before. The ground was reflective like black glass, mirroring the trees but showing a sky that wasn't there. The air was perfectly still, heavy with potential. Echo stood at the center, waiting. When Nate approached, she didn't move, just watched him, with eyes that contained galaxies. "This is it, isn't it?" Nate said softly. "The center of everything." "Not everything." A new voice, gentle and academic. "Just this particular convergence." A man stepped from the tree line, thin, bespectacled, wearing a lab coat decades out of fashion. He appeared both young and ancient, his form occasionally wavering like heat haze. "Dr. Muir," Nate said. Not a question. The figure nodded, a sad smile touching his lips. "What's left of him? Or perhaps just an echo, like your companion." He gestured to Echo, who sat unnaturally still. "An impression left on the fabric of this place." "What is this place?" Nate asked, forcing his voice to remain steady despite the unreality surrounding him. "A mirror," Muir replied, approaching slowly. "A reflection pool for consciousness itself. We discovered it by accident in 1953, a place where reality responds to observation more directly than elsewhere, where perception shapes actuality." The glass-like ground beneath them rippled, and Nate saw images forming: the Afghan mountains, Johnson's face, the shapes moving through dust. His memories projected into physical space. "The military wanted a weapon," Muir continued, his voice taking on a professor's cadence. "A way to alter enemy perception, create hallucinations, break morale. But they didn't understand what they'd found. This isn't a weapon, it's a window. Or perhaps a door." "A door to what?" "To whatever lies beyond human perception, to possibilities." Muir's form flickered again. "We're pattern-making creatures, Sergeant. We impose order on chaos. Here that capacity becomes literal. The forest reflects what you bring to it: fears, memories, guilt." Echo whined softly, drawing Nate's attention. For just a moment, he saw her as she'd been in Afghanistan, dust-covered, alert, saving his life as the ambush unfolded. "She's not real, is she?" Nate asked, the words like glass in his throat. Muir's expression softened. "She was. Once. But what you've been following, it's complicated. Part memory, part projection, part something native to this place. The convergence, zones learn from everyone who enters them. They borrow shapes that have meaning." The ground rippled again, showing Echo in the mountain pass, desperately trying to drag Nate away from Johnson's body, from the shapes approaching it. "You remember now," Muir observed. "The part you've been suppressing." Nate nodded, the memory finally unfolding completely. Echo hadn't just been trying to save him from insurgents that day. She'd seen something else. The same presence that permeated this forest, reaching through a momentary thinning between worlds. And later, when Echo died from injuries sustained in that same ambush, part of Nate had refused to accept it. "I created a loop," Nate said, understanding washing over him. "My guilt, my denial, it shaped my perception, and when I entered the forest gave you what you expected," Muir finished. "An echo of echo, but the loop can't sustain itself forever. Eventually, the pattern breaks down." As if in response, the clearing shuddered. Trees at the perimeter began to bend inward, space folding like origami. The convergence was collapsing. "Your friends found their way out," Muir said, glancing at the distorting forest. Boone followed his brother's echo to the edge where the effect is weaker. The scientist, Talia, her analytical mind fragmented but then reconstituted outside the zone. Lucas has been part of this place too long. He's like me now." "And me?" Nate asked. "How do I leave?" "You have to break the loop. Let go." Muir's eyes flicked to Echo. "Release what binds you here." Echo stood approaching Nate with that familiar grace that had accompanied him through war and peace. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw understanding, not just animal intelligence but something deeper, recognition, forgiveness. The ground beneath them splintered, images racing across its surface, Johnson's death. But now Nate saw it completely. The shapes hadn't been hostile. They'd been curious, investigating, as alien to human experience as humans were to them. Johnson was already dead from insurgent fire when they found him. There had been nothing Nate could have done. And Echo, loyal, brave Echo, had died pulling Nate to safety after he froze in shock at what he was seeing. Her final act of devotion, transformed in his guilt-ridden mind into ongoing presence. "She was never here," Nate whispered, tears blurring his vision. "No," Muir agreed gently. "And yet, in another sense, she never left you." The clearing continued to collapse around them, trees bending until they nearly touched overhead. The air grew thick, hard to breathe. Muir's form wavered, becoming transparent. "You need to go," the scientist's fading voice urged. "The convergence is resetting. It happens periodically, a defense mechanism when too many patterns conflict." Echo sat before Nate, waiting. Her eyes held the same steady gaze that had anchored him through his darkest moments. "How?" Nate asked, his voice breaking. "Release her," Muir whispered, now barely visible. "Release yourself." Understanding flooded through Nate. With trembling fingers, he unclipped Echo's tactical harness, the one she'd worn in Afghanistan, the one she'd been wearing when she died. "Echo," he said, the command catching in his throat. He'd never had to say these words before. "Release." She tilted her head, ears forward, awaiting further instruction. "You're free," Nate continued, tears now flowing freely. "You did your job. You saved me. I'm releasing you from duty." Something shifted in Echo's gaze, a lightening, a joy. She stood tail wagging once and licked Nate's hand, a final gesture of affection. "Go on," he whispered. "You're free." Echo backed away, maintaining eye contact until the last moment. Then she turned and ran toward the bending trees, her form shimmering, dissolving into mist that filtered through the needles and vanished. The clearing shattered like broken glass. Nate felt himself falling, spinning, tumbling through fractured space and time. Fragments of memory and possibility whirled around him. Talia's voice calling his name. Boone reunited with Lucas at the forest's edge. Johnson's final moments. Echo's sacrifice. Then darkness. Nate opened his eyes to blue sky and the antiseptic smell of a hospital room. A park ranger stood at the foot of his bed, relief evident on her weathered face. "Welcome back, Sergeant," she said. "You had us worried." "How long?" His voice was a rasp from disuse. 3 weeks since you went missing. Search team found you at the Eastern Fire Road 5 days ago. You've been unconscious since." memories. Filtered back, distorted, dreamlike. The facility, the convergence zones, Echo leading him through impossible geography. Echo. There was a dog with me, he said, already knowing the answer. The ranger shook her head. You were alone, just you and that old compass clutched in your hand. She nodded to the bedside table, where Lucas's brass compass sat. Nate reached for it with trembling fingers. The needle pointed steadily north, no longer spinning wildly. The others? He asked. Talia Rowe, Chief Boone. Agent Rowe was found the same day you disappeared. Disoriented but physically fine. Chief Boone and his grandson emerged from the forest 2 weeks ago. Both of them. The ranger hesitated. Though Lucas insists he was missing for years, doctors say it's trauma-induced delusion. Nate said nothing to that, he knew better. Later, alone in his room, he held the compass in his palm, watching its steady needle. The window was open, carrying the scent of pine and wilderness. For just a moment, he thought he heard a distant bark on the wind, familiar, reassuring. Goodbye, Echo, he whispered. The compass needle trembled once, then settled again, pointing the way forward, away from the forest that watched and waited, learning from everyone who entered its ancient shadows. Nate closed his eyes, finally at peace with what he'd lost and what he'd found. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.